Once again, if you've just joined in, thank you so much. We're giving it a minute or two for others to log on. Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. We apologize for starting a few minutes late. So this week, the 3rd to the 10th, is Anti-Corruption Week, and it's the fourth year basically that we've initiated this action. And the idea behind Anti-Corruption Week is really to get public awareness going about issues of corruption and continued state capture. And secondly, to also begin to, I think, ensure that the issue of corruption and state capture is something that remains on the public and the national agenda. It isn't something that we must become used to seeing making the headlines on a consistent basis in our country. And that along with championing some of the issues in terms of getting people in orange overalls and ensuring that there's public accountability, also to begin to focus on some of the systemic issues that need to be changed, the policies, the systems of governance in our country to ensure that that in fact corruption is tackled at a systemic level. So I'd like to welcome our guests for today, and we're going to go in order of how they will be speaking. So firstly, we've got Lawson Naidu from KSAC, and they'll be sharing a bit about their work. That will be followed by Letlokhonolo Lechele from Open Secrets, Karam Singh from Corruption Watch, Moiketsi Kawela from the National Youth Coalition, and Wayne Duvenage from the organization Undoing Tax Abuse. All of these organizations have been doing phenomenal work around tackling state capture and corruption in our country for a number of years. In the last year, many would have held a whole range of programs, conferences, activations, workshop sessions on the issue of corruption and state capture. And today's meeting is really to get a sense on where some of that work is, where are the gaps in broader civil society work around tackling state capture and corruption, and really looking at 2025 and how do we build a coherent anti-corruption strategy for civil society organizations and members of the public who are interested in this particular space, and how do we work towards that in 2025 to kind of strengthen our collective efforts as well. So with that, I'm going to welcome Lawson on. Lawson, over to you.
Thank you, Zakira. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning to share some few thoughts around the work that KSAC is involved in, but perhaps more broadly around where we are at this point in time in the fight against corruption. And I'll, come back and I want to talk a little bit about the NPA in particular, because I think that's should be a particular area of concern and focus for us. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So let me just start by giving you a brief overview of the recent workshop that CASAC and Parry hosted on the 15th of November, just a couple of weeks ago. And I'm sure some of you would have been part of that workshop, either in person or online. And as you'll know, this was the third in a series of to conferences and then the workshop this year that we've Parry and CASAC have co-hosted since the publication of the Zondo Commission report in 2022. And the purpose this year was really just to take stock of where we are, what are some of the key issues that we as civil society organizations and the country more broadly need to be focused on in the next period in order to stem the tide against corruption and state capture. So, one of the things, there were a number of speakers. Firstly, let me say that there were a number of speakers at that workshop, which included a keynote address by Paul Pretorius, who was, as you know, the evidence leader at the State Capture Commission, and is now a consultant with the NPA's investigating Directorate Against Corruption. We had the Public Protector, Advocate Kaleka, who shared some of her perspectives in terms of combating corruption from the perspective of the Office of the Public Protector. We had an update on the President's response to the Zondo report, which the President announced 2 years ago. Jonathan Tim from the Presidency gave us an update on where they are. And there were some concerns around that, which I'll come to in a moment. And then we had a panel discussion with various people, including Professor Feroz Kachalia, the chair of the NACAC. So perhaps to start with Jonathan Tim, I mean, it was a fairly open, honest appraisal of where they are. And he acknowledged that they certainly haven't made as much progress as we would all have liked or would like to see. Of the 60 actions, I think 22 have been completed. Some are in progress and at different stages of progress. But aside from the sort of the numbers that one can get into, I think the overall impression, and certainly I think it would be a widespread impression among civil society organizations and the public at large, that there isn't enough urgency in terms of dealing with the Zondo Commission recommendations, in particular from both the executive, from the presidency, government, but also from Parliament as well. That was certainly a concern that came out of that. Professor Kachalia spoke on the NACAC, and I think very important that we must always locate our discussions around combating corruption and state capture within the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. That civil society was involved in putting that together, and we may have some misgivings about the final product. But be that as it may, we do have a framing document that speaks to a whole of society approach to combating corruption. That it's not just about prosecutions; it's very importantly about preventative measures. It's about public awareness and public education. And it's really, everyone must be involved in this fight against corruption. And I'll come back to that point because it relates to what I want to say in a moment about the NPA. So Professor Kachalia then spoke about the fact that the NACAC had submitted what he termed a midterm report to the presidency earlier this year, just ahead of the elections. But very concerningly, I think we're almost 8 months since that report was sent to the presidency. There's been no formal response to the NACAC from the presidency on that report. The report has not yet been made public, but Feroz Kachalia gave us a glimpse into, at least one of the key recommendations that is contained in that report, which is the establishment of an overarching anti-corruption agency, which they're calling an Office on Public Integrity, which will they propose be created as a Chapter 9 institution with wide-ranging powers, including proactively conducting audits, looking at vulnerable sectors, and taking a whole range of measures which in their proposal would be binding recommendations that are made by this Office on Public Integrity. That it would work alongside the NPA, would not take over any prosecutorial powers. The NPA would remain as the prosecutorial body, but it would refer matters for prosecution. That it would work closely with the SRU, and in fact, I think the proposal is that the SRU becomes, a part of this OPI and provides the investigative capacity that the Office on Public Integrity will require. So I think there's a significant step forward there in terms of creating an independent, overarching anti-corruption body, something that I think we need to engage with, and hopefully we as civil society, we will support that with the appropriate checks and balances in place. But it does seem to be a significant step forward in the fight against corruption and state capture. And then coming to the comments that were made by Advocate Paul Pretorius in his keynote address, and I just want to, there are a couple of things that he said, and some of you may have seen an opinion piece that Sarah Mini Gibbert and I wrote in the Sunday Times a couple of weeks ago, where we provided a sort of quick synopsis of that workshop. And one of the things that we said there was that, Advocate Pretorius was visibly agitated, and he said, it's time to stop being nice, and he was referring specifically to us as civil society, that we've been too not robust enough in our engagements in terms of pressurizing government and parliament to take the appropriate action. And one of the things that he said, and he highlighted the fact that the NPA is often blamed for the lack of progress on state capture cases. And his response was he urged us to question why the state was not more effectively empowering the NPA, as well as other relevant agencies to tackle corruption. And to quote him, he said, "We put Volkswagens on the F1 circuit, that is the race against corruption, and then we demand from the drivers of the VWs why they are not competing effectively in the race, when we need to ask the state why it's not putting Ferraris on the track." So, he spoke about the lack of independence, the lack of resourcing of the NPA. He highlighted, for example, the fact that the Zondo Commission had 100 dedicated investigations during its work. The Scorpions in their heyday had 200 specialist investigations. The NPA currently sits with just 22. So if we want to understand why the NPA is not doing more, those are some of the questions that we should be asking, rather than simply undermining and ridiculing the NPA, which seems to have become the flavor of the day. There was a report from the Center for Development Enterprise a few weeks ago, which fortunately David Lewis from NACAC responded publicly to that to correct the misconceptions that were being portrayed in that CDE report. Similarly, there was a report in the Sunday Times by Barney Mtomboti a couple of weeks ago, which I responded to last week in a similar vein. And I think that there's a danger here, and this is really the point I want to make, is, and as civil society, we have rightly been critical of the NPA for its failure, as Zakira said at the beginning, to put people in orange overalls. But we must also accept that it's not, and I would certainly say it's not because of a lack of political will from within the NPA to do so. They certainly seem to be doing their best in very difficult circumstances, one must accept. But where they need to be criticized, they must be criticized, but it must be done fairly, objectively, and with sufficient evidence to back that up. But for me, the danger lies in this sort of wholesale attack on the NPA, the credibility of the NPA. And it's coming from various sources, and this is really the concern. that it could actually, the impact of those attacks could so weaken the NPA, destroy its credibility, that it in fact becomes less able to prosecute corruption cases because certainly from certain political elements that are targeting the NPA, it's done precisely to undermine its credibility so that they don't go after certain political figures who might be in the crosshairs of the NPA. And others who perhaps do not have such a nefarious attitude towards the NPA play into the hands of that strategy by similarly undermining the NPA without acknowledging the severe constraints that the NPA faces. So I'm sure there'll be questions in discussion that we can come back to on this point, but I just wanted to put that out there as a discussion point, because I think it is an issue that as civil society we need to engage in. The final point I want to make, Zakira, before I wrap up, is just again to draw on something that Paul Pretorius said at the workshop a few weeks ago. And he's basically, and paraphrasing, he basically was saying, look, even if we implement all of these under recommendations tomorrow, we will not have succeeded in the fight against corruption and state capture. The modus operandi of state capture participants today is very different from what it was back then. He spoke about the current dynamics of corruption, which now often involves violent criminal syndicates operating across a range of sectors and including new frontiers of organized crime, be it illegal mining, extraction syndicates, assassinations, attempts at extortion, kidnapping of people, sabotage, as well as transnational syndicates. So the kinds of corruption and state capture that we see has evolved, and we need to keep pace with the perpetrators of state capture and corruption, and yet we still seem to be stuck in the past and not moving forward rapidly enough. He spoke about needing to use new technologies, creative and innovative mechanisms to combat this new scourge of corruption. As an example, he mentioned the recent establishment of a digital evidence unit within the NPA, which is being resourced through the private sector, but control with careful checks and balances in place to ensure that it is controlled by the NPA. So those are the sorts of interventions that we need to be thinking about. We need to be a lot more forward-looking in our approach to combating corruption and state capture. The Zondo Commission's recommendations may be a useful starting point, but in the current context in which we find ourselves, it is no more than that as a starting point. We need to do that and a whole lot more. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Lawson. We're now going to get Letlokhonolo on. Letlokhonolo is part of Open Secrets, but Open Secrets and Letlokhonolo and the team is also heading up the civil society working group on tackling state capture and corruption, in particular in relation to the Zondo Commission recommendations. So Letlokhonolo, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Zakira. Good morning to everyone on the call. So I'll just be speaking to our work relating to anti-corruption, and then I'll speak a bit about my opinions on where we are on the fight against state capture and corruption and what sort of priority areas we can focus on for next year. Thanks for the nudge regarding the civil society working group and what we have done this year. I'll speak in particular about the recommendations tracker that we launched, I think, a month ago on the 5th of November. So what the tracker does, it's an online database that monitors the implementation of the Zondo recommendation. I mean, we know the extent of state capture. Lawson touched on it, and you also touched on it, Zakira, when you were speaking. But now the issue was that the report is very dense, it's very long, and it's made up of a lot of recommendations, I think over 350 recommendations. So what we wanted to do with the tracker was to simplify the content, simplify it for not just us, civil society, but also to simplify it for the public. Another reason for putting together the tracker was that, we don't know what the state is doing in terms of implementing the Zondo recommendations. There isn't, any particular communications from them. So we wanted to have a tracker for society and the public so that we can be able to track those recommendations and whether they are being implemented. So what the tracker does, it monitors the implementations, like I said, it identifies who is supposed to be implementing the recommendation, for instance, which institution, which state-owned institution, whether it's parliament or presidency, it shows who's supposed to be implementing that and how far that institution is regarding the implementation of the recommendation. Most importantly, the big question that it answers is that is that institution ultimately addressing state capture with its implementation of the recommendation. Another reason for the tracker was to put pressure for those in power to ensure that recommendations are implemented. Sorry to lose it, but yeah, to put pressure on the NPA to prosecute and investigate, not just the NPA, Parliament, Presidency, so that because people will be able to see the tracker and seeing that institutions are not doing what they're supposed to do or they're struggling, so it will, enhance that effort from those people to be doing what they're supposed to be doing. And I think lastly, the point of the tracker was for us as a society to be able to systematically, track the implementation. We do different parts of work. I know on this call we are in a collective because we do work on anti-corruption, but we do have different, focuses. So what the tracker is going to do is going to help us monitor the different elements of our work that we do, and it's going to be able to, help us to have a better focus on anti-corruption. Another anti-corruption work that Open Secrets has been doing, Open Secrets works towards exposing economic crime. So naturally, we are interested in private companies. If you remember, one of the biggest critiques from the Zondo Commission was that to an extent, disregarded the role of private companies that were involved in state capture. In our report, one said we follow the enablers of state capture, but one of the arguments that we put forward is that these are easy for law enforcement to investigate, for the NPA to investigate and prosecute, because evidence implicating these companies in state capture is clear, and it was put forward at the Zondo Commission. And we also advocate for the investigation and prosecution of private actors that were involved. And there also should be prosecution and asset recovery, not just the other without the other. I think this morning we saw the communication from the NPA about McKinsey essentially settling on money instead of prosecuting. So I think this is one of the things that we are referring to. We also did some work on the NPA, but mostly which was the submission. Remember, there was a bill that was tabled. We made a submission regarding the investigation directorate and arguing that it could do with some work, clarifying its scope, mandate, and independence. This was broadly a civil society effort. Most of civil societies did give input on this. And again, on the NP, I just wanted to say, there are officials and prosecutors who occupy senior positions who hamper, some of the efforts of the institution to investigate cases and harassing of whistleblowers. So this is a serious obstruction of justice, and I think needs to be seriously looked at. I mean, notwithstanding what Lawson said about the NPA, which is also true, and I guess we can discuss. And I guess for the second question, what would be, where are we in the fight against corruption? Generally speaking, like I said initially, we still do not know what the state is doing to implement the Zondo recommendations. Whether they're implementing or not, they are certainly not doing a good job in communicating what they're doing. There isn't any regular communications from various departments to say, or institutions to say, this is what we are doing, this is where we are at, this is how we are struggling, this is where we need help. So that communication regarding what they're doing isn't forthcoming. From Parliament, from Presidency, but I mean, we did hear from the Presidency at the Pericasa conference, but I guess that was the recent time, and we haven't really had much before that. So I think they could really ramp up a bit in terms of communicating. Maybe they are actually doing something, but as the public, we are unable to see what's happening. I guess, where are we in the fight against state capture and corruption with regards to whistleblowing? This refers to legislative reform. Much of the information from the Zondo Commission came through whistleblowers. And however, the law protecting whistleblowers is inadequate. Whistleblowers were victimized and they continue to be victimized. The context in mind here is the PRASA case. So what we got from the Zondo Commission, the recommendation was that government should introduce legislation or amend existing legislation that will protect whistleblowers, but in particular, in the context of public procurement, because if you remember, most of the key corruption that took place was in the context of public procurement. So the recommendation regarding the whistleblowing was around physical protection of whistleblowers, identities of whistleblowers to be hidden, creating a specific agency that deals with corruption and public procurement, establishing inspectorate to deal with the protection of whistleblowers, immunity from criminal proceedings, but most importantly, incentivizing whistleblowers from the recoveries of the assets that we from corruption. So unfortunately, this is not happening, or the progress has been slow. Yeah, and then I guess also I wanted to speak a bit on the state-owned enterprises. It's been 6 years since the new leadership at the NPA, and having an investigating directorate that exclusively deals with state corruption-related cases. However, there's still nothing much on prosecution at state-owned enterprises, namely PRASA, SAA, Denel, and SARS. And I guess we know the issues of the NPA, but however, I feel that there are some easy targets in terms of investigating and prosecuting. I mean, the evidence is there implicating the people or the institutions in state capture. But I just wanted to reiterate this point that the corruption at this institution, it affects the lives of ordinary people. For example, the crime or the corruption at PRASA affects people who used to take trains and people who are employed by that state institution. And corruption at this institution has inhibited these SOEs from fulfilling their role. And the nature of the collapse has really eroded public trust in this institution and as well as in democracy. Just lastly, to sum up my contribution, what are the key priority areas of society to focus in 2024, excuse me, 2025? It's the Zondo recommendation tracker. Let's look at it and let's try to inform our advocacy strategies, then seeing what's happening and where we can put pressure in terms of what the institutions that are doing. And I guess we can do advocacy around writing to institutions that are tasked with implementing recommendations. Institutions such as the presidency and parliament, let's not wait for Jonathan Tim to come and address us at a particular conference. Let's take initiative and write to the presidency and ask them how far they are in terms of implementing the specific recommendations that are targeted at them, and let the public know of the communication. I guess this is for civil society. And this is something that the Civil Society Working Group is going to consider doing. We want to engage the seventh Parliament on how far are they implementing various recommendations. If you remember, many of the recommendations were directed to Parliament, especially with regards to oversight. So we really want to get a sense of how far Parliament is. And just to wrap up in terms of what we can do for next year would be, civil action. Taking action against particular institutions and forcing them to implement the recommendation. For example, private prosecution and force institutions like the Hawks and NPA to prosecute corruptions, especially in state-owned institutions like PRASA and SAA and SARS. Yeah, that's pretty much my contribution. Thank you so much, Sakira.
Thanks so much for that, Letloponolo. And I think we'll see how best to pick up some of those recommendations for 2025. I want to welcome Karam Singh from Corruption Watch. Thanks for joining us, Karam. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Sakira. Can you hear me okay? Just checking that my sound is okay.
Yes, it's perfect. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much, Zakira, to you and everybody involved in pulling this meeting together. A lot of alignment with what the previous speakers have said. just while it's on my mind in terms of what Lawson said in terms of the MPA, is just noting this kind of, what was Paul Pretorius really saying when he was talking about the MPA being under attack? And, the concern that, beyond the criticism, potentially unfair criticism in the media, that there are maybe other elements within the state, still within national intelligence, even within the MPA itself, that are working at cross purposes. This issue around security clearances for the top leadership of the MPA was something which also came up in the recent period, which does raise some concerns. Going to try to stick to my 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to go through this really quickly, and please excuse me if some of it's a bit disjointed. Just very briefly on who Corruption Watch is. Corruption Watch was launched in 2012. So we're into our second decade now. We have a new vision and mission statement, a vision statement which talks about creating an equitable society, actively engaged in countering corruption and pursuing justice, a mission statement of exposing, confronting, and taking preventative action against corruption. This is this idea of, in terms of the all of society approach and even the logic of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, that much of our work is very reactive. The calls for investigations, the whole kind of criminal justice response is very reactive. And I think increasingly, as we think about interventions in the fight against corruption, we do need to think about, the implications of implementing Zondo Commission recommendations, implementing the National Anti-Corruption Strategy for creating a more robust preventative system, a system where corruption vulnerabilities are addressed, where there's greater transparency in the system so we can pick up issues earlier. And this, I think, is also informing some of the work of the SIU in terms of thinking about what a preventative framework against the fight against corruption might look like. Corruption Watch works from a broad set of tools, including research, strategic litigation, policy and legislative submissions, engagement in multi-stakeholder partnerships and engagements, public education and advocacy. The work of the Civil Society Working Group on State Capture is something we've been part of. The public procurement working group, our engagements that we've been critically involved in. In terms of the rollout now of the Procurement Act, we see Treasury reaching out to many in civil society to join different work groups in terms of the drafting of the regulations. I think, there was still a lot of concern about the public procurement bill in terms of, has it gone far enough in terms of the transparency requirements, in terms of the requirements around publication, in terms of strengthening the role of oversight and enforcement. So I think we're stuck with this act now, and I think a lot of work in this period is going to have to be around ensuring the best potential implementation of the act in consideration, and then ultimately of is it constitutionally compliant? Is it fit for purpose? And if not, what would our strategies then be for revising the legislation? In terms of recent work, in terms of strategic litigation, we were in a couple of prominent cases in the run-up to the election and in the fallout. Two involving the MK party, one involving challenges around Jacob Zuma taking up a parliamentary seat, and the other one in terms of the challenge against John Schlope taking up a seat on the JSC. I don't want to, one doesn't declare victory too easily on these things. I think, in terms of what's going on, in terms of the attacks on the MPA, and in terms of some of the statements coming out of Parliament and some of the entities there, I think we do have to acknowledge that there is a fight back in terms of persons implicated in state capture who are still holding positions of influence, who want to try to shift the narrative, who want to kind of pour cold water on Zondo, the Zondo Commission interventions, and I think we need to be really careful about that and keep our antennas up really closely in terms of that fight back. On the question of where we are as a country in the fight against corruption, I do think that there's two ways of looking at this, which are divergent. The one is a more optimistic view that we're potentially in a much better place than we've been for a long time in terms of pushing anti-corruption initiatives, in terms of doubling down on some of the key recommendations which haven't been implemented in terms of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, in terms of the Zondo Commission recommendations. I think we're in a better place when it comes to the establishment of key institutions within the state. Despite all of what we've said about the NPA, it is in a better place than it was recently. SARS is in a much better place. We do need to look critically at the various institutions, independent institutions, including the Chapter 9s broadly and the public protector, in terms of ensuring that they're able to execute their mandate and be responsive to this current moment. I think more pessimistically, I think there's a sense that endemic systemic corruption is as bad as it's ever been. That there's an entrenchment of certain types of organized criminal activity, syndicated criminal activity linked to public officials and political parties, that there remains uncertainties and key vulnerabilities within the system, weaknesses across the criminal justice system in terms of crime intelligence, in terms of the alignment of different elite agencies, what's going to be the future of the independent directorate given other, recommendations around new institutions. So it's very much a mixed bag, in terms of, our affiliation with Transparency International and the CPI. I think that score continues to stagnate, the sense that we're not making real significant progress. I agree with the previous speaker in terms of a failure of government to properly communicate in terms of initiatives that have gone forward. I think we're keeping an eye on what's happening in terms of getting South Africa off the grey list in terms of the FATF recommendations and whether we'll be able to get off the grey list on the basis of kind of a technical compliance or whether the changes that are being made, initiatives in terms of combating things like money laundering will actually be significant. But I do think the expectation or the time frame on that is to get off the grey list sometime in 2025. In terms of key priority areas for civil society, as I sort of wind down for 2025, I do think Parliament is a revived site of struggle. I think this has come up in the various engagements. One of the things that I was very encouraged by was the briefing given to civil society by the new SCOPA chair, Songezo Zibi. I think he made all the right noises, gave all the indications that he's really on top of the issues and the important role that SCOPA has to play. We need to then think about how that can cascade down into reviving public accounts committees in the provinces and at local government. Broadly on the issue of criminal justice sector reform, Lawson's flagged the NACAC recommendation on the Office of Public Integrity, and then we need to hold that up against the private members bill introduced by the DA in terms of an independent anti-corruption agency. What are the gaps between those two models? I think one of the key ones relates to the issue of the prosecution's mandate. I think the private members bill envisions the anti-corruption agency being able to kind of carry investigations from detection through to prosecution, which would then alter the exclusive mandate of the MPA to prosecute. It was really interesting. I think Feroz Kachalia spoke openly at the conference around the implications of all of this for the future of the SIU. It doesn't strike me that all of this has been fully thought out. The SIU is a creature of statute. It doesn't have self-authorizing jurisdiction. It can only do investigations with a presidential proclamation. This would very much be in tension with the idea of a self-authorizing anti-corruption agency. I don't think all of those issues have been fully thought out. I spoke about the engagement around ensuring the best implementation of the Public Procurement Act. We need to flag that South Africa has taken over the chairpersonship of the G20. There's an anti-corruption working group in the G20. There's the B20. There's the C20. There's a meeting going on this morning, I think, that Oxfam is hosting on the issues around the C20. All of us need to be engaged with that. And I think that's, again, an interesting space. And then, also in terms of, geopolitics, understanding some of the tensions that may emerge with South Africa's chairpersonship of the G20 and continued participation in BRICS. I'm running out of time now, so I got to quickly run through these last few in terms of broad areas of focus for Corruption Watch and for the rest of us. We need to keep a spotlight on local government. Local government is, in many places is on the verge of collapse. Focus on youth. Understanding implications for anti-corruption initiatives for youth, engaging the youth, a focus on gender and issues around sexual corruption, issues around culture change and behavior change, continued development of digital tools, greater protection for whistleblowers, and working on working through the opportunity provided by the DOJ discussion paper last year. Including, pushing for initiatives around a public entity to support whistleblowers, financial support, and incentivization of whistleblowing. I'll just note in closing, I was at a really interesting engagement yesterday, hosted by a multi-stakeholder group, including the University of Stellenbosch, News 24, spoke at length with Jeff Wicks, who's been on the Tembisa Hospital matter, and Rakesh Diakaran, Bita Diakaran's brother. I do think this new initiative of News 24 to have a platform to be able to receive reports of corruption and receive documents in a very safe way is a really interesting development. And Corruption Watch is engaging with News 24 around potential collaborations in terms of taking forward some of that work. Okay, Zakira, I've gone over time. Sorry if that was a bit disjointed, but let me leave it there. Thank you.
No problem at all. Thanks so much for those insights, Karam. I'd like to welcome Moeketsi Kawela, who is the head of the National Youth Coalition, and they recently hosted a youth conference against corruption, which was very interesting, had a number of significant speakers. So Moeketsi, over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Zakira. If you can just kindly confirm to me if I'm audible.
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, colleagues. But yeah, I think also just to echo some of the, provocations and stories that have been shared here by the colleagues on the panel. So my name is Moeketsi Kwahela, and I'm the interim chairperson of the National Youth Coalition, representing the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation on the coalition. And I mean, essentially for ourselves, part of what we do is that, we are interested in promoting, the development of ethical and transformative young leaders who really just work to, strive to ensure that, again, all young people, youth, as we know it in South Africa, are empowered, but also just supported in terms of their, the attainment of their constitutional and human rights. And really what we do is that we have 7 working groups that we work through. So one is, quality education. The second one is on decent work. The third one is on gender. The fourth one on climate justice. And, the fifth one on governance. Number 6 on health. And also the last one around issues of arts and culture. And as Zakira has mentioned, recently, in partnership with the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation's Youth Activism Program, or the Youth Department, but also in partnership with GIZ's, South Africa's Transparency, Integrity and Accountability Program. but also the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, and the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, or NACEC as we know it. We recently hosted a 2-day National Youth Dialogue on Anti-Corruption, specifically on the 16th and 17th of November, where we really just, brought young people as a lead up to, again, to this week around, the National Dialogue on Anti-Corruption in December. That's actually happening next week, where, again, where stakeholders from around the country and all walks of life will just really converge to really just, validate the NACEC's proposals on anti-corruption reform. But also, part of that conference that we did and held was just dedicated to hearing and just acknowledging as well the voices of the youth, right? And really what I want to do is that I just want to, share some of the outcomes of that youth conference that we held, but also some of those outcomes from the young people who attended the youth conference will also be presented at the NACEC's conference that is happening next week, particularly around, the National Anti-Corruption Strategy and, the OPI, the Office of, Public Integrity that, they're seeking to establish through the NACEC platform. The colleagues here have also just shared a bit about, NACEC, but also some of the important developments that have been in that space, and I won't share much on that. But really what I wanted to share on is that, so specifically on the National Youth Dialogue on Anti-Corruption and specifically like the outcomes, what we did is that we started with like having an interactive session with the young people, particularly using Mentimeter, right? By asking them, 5 questions around. So for example, one of the questions was around, what word or phrase comes to mind when, you think of corruption, right? And some of the words that really came out was, mismanagement, Zondo commissions, power abuse, the stealing from public, injustice, fraud, and so on, right? Undue benefication and ethical behavior. And the second question we really wanted to find out from the young people who had gathered in that space was, do they feel like government is doing something to fight corruption? And, they had to choose between yes or no or somewhat. And, about 5% said yes, around 20% said no, and about 7% said somewhat, right? And, some of the third question that we asked was around, what can organized business, but also private sector do to fight corruption? Because we were quite clear that, in combating corruption is going to take a whole of society approach, right? It's simply not going to be us in civil society or those who are in the public sector, but also what is the role of business as well in coming to the table and fighting the scourge. And really some of the things that they shared was around, that, organized business must be transparent. There should be skills development in our communities, but also just world issues, investing in anti-corruption initiatives and all those things. I'm going to skip some of the questions that we asked because they were quite lengthy. And really part of what also we did in that conference was to introduce the young people on NACEC itself. What is the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, right? And part of that session was really facilitated by Councillor Nkosana Dolopi from NACEC, who just really provided, useful background around NACEC and what really led to the establishment of NACEC, right? What is their mandate? How does the advisory role work, particularly on the implementation of NECs, right? But also just, their role in strengthening South Africa's anti-corruption, architecture and engaging citizens on really what can be done as we combat corruption, through anti-corruption summits that they want to host, but also just, the work that they do around advising the president and of course on the implementation of the recommendation from the Zondo Commission, right? And really, one of the sessions that we also held was that we also had like youth feedback, particularly around, the social norms of corruption and questions on the Office of Public Integrity that NACEC wants to, to establish, right? Because, even NACEC in that summit, they really made a call to encourage, our young people to play an active role in the fight against corruption, as leaders of tomorrow, right? Particularly because, our government and public institutions, have, to a certain degree failed, due to corruption, but also just wanting to show young people their role in playing, what is the kind of anti-corruption work that they need to take on, given that, they are also affected in their communities, in their everyday lived, experiences, right? And part of that consultations, Zakira and the colleagues on the recommendations of the establishment of the Office of Public Integrity by NACEC was, what we did was to also just provide our young people there in terms of what do they think in terms of like their reflections on the concept itself, particularly as it relates to the functioning of it, the governance of it, and what kind of resources it would require to function well, and what kind of institutions it could collaborate with, but also the role of young people there, right? And I mean, for example, some of the youth feedback there, young people, shared, so one of them is around social norms leading to corruption, right? So some of our young people said that, the capitalist system, so capitalist system and corruption. So what the argument was that, capitalism, for example, inherently promotes corruption, due to its emphasis on wealth accumulation and exploitation of labor, but also some of the things that they shared was around, the perception of corruption among disadvantaged groups. And they felt that, given our country's levels or high levels of inequality, Black people in the main, but also non-white people are often seen as more corrupt because they strive to achieve the artificial, standards of wealth and success established by those who own the means of production. Some of the things that were also shared was around service delivery, and corruption of convenience, right, according to them. And this they really described as, slow and inefficient service delivery systems, as a cause of corruption of convenience, right, where people resort to bribery to expedite processes. And, colleagues, some of the questions that are also raised by the young people there is, one, integrity in public sector roles. So we had young people asking, how do we restore integrity and accountability in sectors like the police, where, they were once respected roles, but are now viewed with, some level of disgrace. The second questioning around that the young people who gathered in that space, raised was around youth, technology, and whistleblowing, right? So, how can the youth be protected when using technology to combat corruption, given the current threats to whistleblowers? But also, does the council, for example, NACEC itself, does it have any structures or tangible advisory measures in place to address this issue? But also they also questioned, Chapter 9 institutions, particularly the criteria for Chapter 9 institutions, right? So regarding, the recommendation for a Chapter 9 institution that NACEC wants to establish to address corruption, they asked what criteria would ensure, its integrity, especially considering concerns around cadre deployment and potential corruption within the institution itself. But also one last question that they asked around was around accountability and institutional proliferation, right? So, which is to say there's concerns about avoiding accountability by creating multiple institutions, right? So how would a proposed anti-corruption Chapter 9 institution differ from existing bodies, like the public protector, right? What powers or resources would it need? And is the consideration for a specialized anti-corruption court similar to those in Botswana, Cameroon, and Kenya as well? We also, provided, in that conference, colleagues, the space for young people to reflect on the structure of the Office of Public Integrity that NACEC wants to establish, and we really ask ourselves, what does a well-functioning OPI look like, right? And some of the suggestions that the young people suggested in that conference was it must meet its objective. It must investigate corruption. It must carry out effective and informative awareness on broader social media, right? Because our young people are on social media platforms and all those things. So it must be accessible in essence, right? But also it must do work around the protection or effective protection of whistleblowers for effective reporting, right? But also, clearly defined, but also just have a clearly defined criteria of what it constitutes or who sits in the Office of the Public Integrity, right? But also that, and these are some of the things that have been raised here as well. It must be well coordinated, well funded, capacitated expertise, inclusive, but also independent, right? And again, very huge emphasis on it must be accessible, and that there should be a coalition between, the Office of the Public Integrity, right, and civil society, right? And what that means is that it must formulate structures, policies that suit society at large, but also that it must really have a clear mandate, because there isn't a sense that, even the proposal that has been proposed by NACEC, they're getting a clear sense of having a clear mandate that it should be accountable, have integrity and transparent, a well-functioning OPI that also involves a youth directorate. So the young people who were there also said that the Office of Public Integrity must also have a youth wing or a youth directorate where, again, it will specifically deal with youth-related issues around, the anti-corruption work that young people must start taking up, right? We also talked about how should it be governed, right? But also what resources does it need? Which institutions does it need to collaborate with? And some of those institutions, they talked about churches, businesses, CSOs, other existing Chapter 9 institutions, law enforcement agencies, SIS, NPA scope, and civil society. So really a multi-stakeholder partnership, right? And in terms of, when we asked them and when they deliberated and dialogued around some of the key areas that, OPI should focus on, particularly in this conference that we were in, was around public procurement, oversight of public institutions, including employment into those institutions. It must focus on research. It must focus on investigations. There should be advocacy and public awareness and education campaigns that young people themselves can take up in their communities, but also supporting community organizing against corruption, education, health, and law enforcement. But also, some of the things that we also looked at in our conference was how can OPI then include youth in its design so that youth issues are not excluded, right? So what does a program, design look like where actually young people are actually factored in, not only in its purpose statement, but also in the objectives and the outcomes of those programs that will be hopefully established by NACEC through the Office of Public Integrity, right? But also we also held sessions around what are some of the normalized behaviors among young people, us as young people that also contribute to corruption, right? So in a way, holding the mirror to ourselves. Am I doing better on time, Zakira?
I think so. You have a minute
Okay,
to
cool.
round up. That's okay.
Sure. No, but really, colleagues, I think in just wrapping up, part of the conference that we held as the National Youth Coalition was to say, what is the kind of, anti-corruption work that we as well as young people must start taking up, not only at a national level and all those things, but also in our communities, because again, some of the young people who were there come from communities where they are, particularly mining communities, where they are faced with issues of corruption, right? And, they often reach out to the coalition. I mean, in the coalition, we also have the right to protest that also assists our young people in those communities where they are dealing with these issues. And, even the Equal Education Law Center that comes in and provides, legal advice whenever they are faced with these issues. So yeah, these are some of the work that we have done and some of the things that have come out, out of our own, youth conference that we held with NACEC, but also GIZ and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime Prevention around, again, getting that youth voice in so that we, young people can also just, say their piece around anti-corruption work that they must take up. Thank you very much, Zakira.
Thanks, Moeketsi. And I think we look forward to see how some of the suggestions filter into the conference that's taking place on the 9th of December, because I believe that's where some of these conference outcomes are going towards. Thanks so much for that. Just to urge everyone on the call, please put your questions in the chat. There will be a very short space of time, but we're going to try and have some interaction after the last presentation. And I'd like to welcome Wayne Duvenage from OUTA. Wayne, go ahead.
Good day. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to be as brief as I can then. Just not to go too deep into OUTA's structure and methodology, other than to say that our work really revolves around working with information and evidence that has been gathered, a lot of it through whistleblowers, to hold people to account. We work very closely with other oversight entities, criminal justice system, SIU in particular, Hawks, NPA, just to help them also build their cases to gather strong evidence. And this is where we sense that there is a need, an urgent need, but a long-term strategic need to capacitate the criminal justice system. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But really what we need to do and what we see is part of our job and role is other than using our methodology of getting the facts and engaging with the authorities and then exposing the matter, it goes into mobilizing and litigation. And this is costly, it takes time, but we're always prepared for that, because what we find so often is that the perpetrators of corruption and gross maladministration have got time and money on their side. They use the state's money and they try and wear you down. Which is what we've got to continuously prevent ourselves for. And so we have litigation war chest, so to speak, and we will go the whole hog. We will go the long route if need be. We will take on these challenges. But what we see, sadly, is that so many whistleblowers really meet this fate of, if it's not assassination, like Babita Deokaran was very unfortunate to experience in her family. It is the ostracizing of whistleblowers. It is the job loss. It is the livelihood loss. It is the pressure, the stress, the strain, and they are really suffer at the consequences of having to speak out or stand up against corruption. So we see so many good people inside the state that are doing their best to undo the corruption that's taking place, but only to see how so often they will end up on the being far worse off and don't speak up. So part of our job is to coach them and make sure that they don't put themselves into a precarious position, that they don't that they are not vulnerable, and how to manage corruption from a collection of evidence point of view, staying out of the limelight and feeding the information back so we can build cases against those who are inside the system. So I think today what we're seeing is that the notion of state capture hasn't gone away. It's just very different. It doesn't involve a president and a presidency overtly setting up the structures and stealing as much as they can from the state. This time around, and what's been happening, and that's quite frankly, we see it as worse than ever before, is the structures have been in place for some time and they've got stronger. They control the procurement and tender processes and the spending processes within state institutions, within state bodies. And then outside of that, but it's part of the whole chain. These networks and syndicates are involved in criminal activities as well, illicit trade, the mining issues, the extortion, and the list goes on. But what we are focused on is state resource corruption, and it's big in certain areas. Very big still in the higher education space through the SETAs, where there's a lot of money and easy manipulation of procurement systems. We see it in the transport department. We see it in PetroSA and minings, minerals. It is continues unabated, and that's the shocking reality that we have to deal with and tackle. As I was saying earlier on, part of the strategy, once we get the facts and the evidence and line ourselves up for litigation if need be, and working with the criminal justice system, is to drive the narrative, to never let go of exposing what is going on. And a classic case of that was in NSFAS. It started in the services SETA with Andile Nongogo. We got enough information. It takes time. We have to go and get this information through PIA applications, court cases, through the information regulator. But if we're resilient in what we know and what we're driving, we get there eventually. So after Bladen Zamande at higher education, who had continuously said there was nothing untoward with Andile Nongogo, who became from the CEO of Services SETA to the CEO of NSFAS. Eventually, he was fired, and his chairperson had to resign as well. And this is after being told by the minister's office that there was nothing wrong with what was going on. Well, they eventually had to eat humble pie on that, and now it's in administration. But this modus operandi of inflating prices and hijacking procurement it's rife and it continues today unabated. Millions and millions of rands given to undeserved entities and siphoned out of the system. And the poorest of the poor suffer the most. The students, the skills upliftment strategies and programs for the country are just held captive through this misspending. And I think it's very, very important as we go into the new year. Is that we really have to, I think, as Lawson was speaking about with Paul Pretorius and the efforts that we're seeing or not seeing enough of, and that is civil society. I think leading up to February's budget speech, budget allocations, we need to put as much pressure on government to allocate the necessary funds to enact the next strategy and enable it, but also to start capacitating the NPA, the SIU, the Hawks, and others, but without throwing people at the problem, putting in the systems, getting the international help where need be. And there's a lot of international help there in training investigators and forensics specialists to come into the system because it has been decimated. They are under immense pressure. We are really not going to move forward if we do not capacitate. We need to really turn this whole fight against corruption on its head. When I say that, SARS has got immense powers. The illicit trade that is taking place, if we can follow the money more effectively and start shutting down these networks using those methodologies and capacitating big crime avenues that we have to fight as a criminal justice system, I think we will get there. So are we in a better place today? I think while it is rife, we're better poised and positioned as a country. But we need the new government of national unity. We've seen some doors opening in the corridors of power, but not enough to engage with civil society, to understand exactly what's happening. We've got a lot of evidence, but if the ministers and the DGs are going to continue to look away and not do their work, then it's going to take a lot longer. Just to further that issue, the Parliament's role and its oversight role needs to be stepped up. So we're really excited about seeing Songezo Zibi's work in SCOPA and some of the other parliamentary portfolio committees. But we need to put them under pressure to take the information that we have as civil society and to start holding the executive to account. As a result of this, we've launched Parlimeter. We'll be launching it formally in the new year. We've been working on it for a year. It is an digital oversight dashboard mechanism that puts a spotlight on the performance of Parliament, on attendance, meeting attendance, bill tracking, and so forth. It's going to be very exciting, and we'll tell you more about that when we launch it to all our stakeholders. We're working with Parliament to make sure that the data we collect and with PMG and open up to present a really influential tool for civil society to make sure that Parliament does its work. So overall, just finishing off, I think we've got a lot of work to do next year, but it's collectively up to civil society and all of us here to place government under pressure to do the work of taking the fight against corruption seriously. It hasn't been done so sufficiently enough over the last 5 years. We are in a very bad state when it comes to local government, the lack of revenues because it's being siphoned off, as well as in many government departments, both provincial and... Okay, that's me. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Wayne. I'm going to ask if there are any questions. I see Gary has put something in the chat, but I think that's just a comment. Are there any questions? If you have a question, you're free to put it in the chat. You can lift up your hand as well. We'll try and unmute you. Okay, while we're waiting for that, maybe I have a couple of questions. I think the first is really looking at the NPA into next year. We know that the term of office of the current National Director of Public Prosecutions is going to come to an end. And there's been a call previously made to the presidency to institutionalize some form of transparency around appointment processes, particularly for senior appointments in the criminal justice system. And I just want to get a sense, maybe from Corruption Watch, maybe Lawson, perhaps you have some insights, or anyone else here, on whether there's been any headway in that regard, or should we as broader civil society be making that call more strongly? Feel free to come in, any of the speakers.
I'm happy to weigh in on this. I think it's an important issue around the independence of the NPA, which is one of the issues that has been raised previously in terms of not just the fact that it currently reports through the Department of Justice, and the DG of Justice is the accounting officer of the NPA, but this issue around the appointment process for the NDPP. As we recall, the last time around when Shamila Batoya was appointed, there was a panel that the president established consisting of people from the legal fraternity as well as Chapter 9 bodies. But that was a voluntary process. It needs to be institutionalized. I'm not sure whether it's that there's sufficient time for it to be institutionalized ahead of the appointment of the next NDPP. As you say, Shamila Batoya's tenure ends in January 2026. So really, this process needs to get underway by the middle of next year, I would say. And I think, even if there's no legislative change by then, we need a civil society to ensure that there's sufficient pressure being put on the presidency to follow the same or similar approach in the appointment of the next NDPP. It's critical to the credibility and the independence of the person appointed to take over. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Lawson.
Zakir, I think, sorry, Zakir, I think Lawson covered it. Yeah, I think Lawson covered it. Your question was, have the rules around appointments being institutionalized, for these key appointments, and they haven't. So Lawson's absolutely right, and it's good that you flagged it. I do think we can expect a good process, but based upon the current conditions, it'll be something ad hoc, because that the question of how we deal with these key appointments in terms of agreed set of processes hasn't been legislated yet.
Thanks for that. And Karam, while you are on, maybe just if you could expand on your points around the kind of political scenarios, given that next year will very much be a pre-election year. Political campaigning begins to start, from around about the middle of next year for local government elections in 2026. And I've, some of the speakers, yourself and Wayne, have been indicating that we sort of in a better space than we were in previously. But the question that I'm really asking is that better space going to hold from a political perspective, given that it is a pre-election year, that there may be all sorts of other things coming up, including internal political dynamics within the ANC and other political parties. So just your sense on the politics of the country.
Yeah, no, I don't think any of us can confidently feel settled, on the issue of politics. I think I think we can take some comfort that that we had a substantially free and fair and a good election. But I think there are things that happened in this election that we didn't anticipate in terms of the amount of support that parties that have a different agenda, the type of support that they received. And I think, those parties will be very active as well in terms of trying to consolidate their gains, by actively campaigning for local government. So, I think politics remains inevitably unsettled. And I think we'll see more instability in the local government space before we see, any sense of comfort or stability, or a sense that local government's on a better trajectory as a result of outcomes that flow from politics. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Karam. Just once again, if you have any questions, please put up your hand or you can pose a question in the chat. I see there's something in the chat. We should find more patriots vying for government elective posts. And maybe that brings us to the issue of selection of people for political positions, for positions of members of parliament or members of the provincial legislatures. And maybe Lawson can come in on that, but I'm going to ask just before that, Wayne, you spoke about the parliamentary oversight work that OUTA is doing, but maybe a question that's a bit tongue in cheek to you. How do we effectively hold parliamentarians to account for doing parliamentary oversight work when a number of parliamentarians themselves may be implicated within the Zondo Commission report? Some may be having pending charges against them, or particular, allegations that they need to face up to. So just your views on that, and then we'll take Lawson on the issue of some of the elements of broader electoral reform that I think speaks to patriots vying for government elective posts. And then Faisal, I see your hand up. We'll come to you thereafter. Wayne? Okay, I think he's not online at the moment. Let's get Lawson.
Thank you, Zakira. Yeah, so look, there's an important process that's unfolding at the moment that I think we all need to be involved in, and that is the work of the Electoral Reform Consultation Panel that was established through legislation. It's a 9-person body that was established just before in May this year, just before the elections. There's been a call for proposals from that body to the public, and they had a consultative meeting with organizations earlier this week in Parliament. And they're adopting quite an open, transparent approach, but they've got to be kept honest. They received over 300 submissions, and the question that was posted in the chat about getting credible people nominated for elected positions will be the possibility of that will be an outcome of this process if we are able to convince, as I think many civil society organizations would like to see, a move towards some kind of constituency system, whether it be a single-member constituency or a multi-member constituency system, but to bring our elected representatives closer to the people and therefore more accountable. And the mechanism to do that is to put pressure on the Electoral Reform Panel to put forward amongst its options that it will be putting forward to Parliament some kind of constituency model. So we move away from the closed party list system that has led to this grave accountability deficit that we see today. And as you point out, Zakira, with people who are implicated in state capture and corruption occupying sometimes very high positions, senior positions within Parliament. So that's an opportunity. The panel will be making its submission to Parliament in May next year, so there's not a long time to go. But they did commit that there would be a broader consultative process. The 2-day conference is being planned for early April next year. So I think, in terms of strengthening accountability within the legislative sector, that it's important that as civil society we participate in the process, we're involved in the process, and we do the best that we can to help to shape the outcome that gives us an electoral system that is really fit for purpose.
Thanks for that, Lawson. Let's get Faisal and then Ila.
Yes, thank you, Zakira, and all the panel and participants. Great session, great coverage. Forgive me for joining a little late. So you may have covered the point I want to make and the question I want to pose. I belong to an organization that facilitates a lot of civil society challenges. The organization is called MUSA, the Movement for United South Africa. And one of the key things we promote is ethical, moral, selfless leadership, trying to encourage more and more people in leadership positions to steer towards greater ethical, moral, and selflessness. We have, fortunately, many in our midst, and through the struggle against apartheid and injustices, people of that caliber who've contributed. Now, a lot of the criminal aspects and the kind of topics we're covering today touch on ways that we can deal or at least improve the situation in South Africa with respect to these challenges. What we've been promoting is a kind of a barometer or checkpoint, and I think what Lawson touched on is also addressing the kind of macro positioning that we need to bring into play. So while we may address the micro, what I'm referring to as micro is not small as such, but really across all the aspects of corruption that we face in government, through corporates, through individual weaknesses and so on. So the question I want to put is, have we currently or in this session or in the future, are we going to focus on the kind of macro influences that come into play? We know that crime is a global phenomenon.
I'm going to ask you just to wrap up because we're running out of time.
Okay, yeah, I see that. So crime is a global phenomenon, and we need to have some things to deal with that level. So we've got BRICS now as an established entity, and I just like to position that we need to focus on the macro aspects that somehow filter down to politics, parliament, even buying out key stakeholders in corporates and in government. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Faisal. Let's get Ila, and then we'll take a question in the chat, and then all of the panelists will have a turn to answer and round up.
Thank you. Thanks, Zakira, and thanks to all the speakers. My question is, we have some very good structures like the school governing bodies, like the police, community police forums, and so on, ward committees, etc. But most of them are so ineffective. We had a meeting recently where people were saying that they are so afraid of talking about things that are happening in the community. They know what is going on in terms of crime, in terms of corruption, but they are too afraid to talk about it. So if these bodies could be strengthened, and my question is, how is there some way in which we can ensure that all these, bodies get some training and become more effective? Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Comrade Ila. And I think linked to that is the question that Sipo poses in the chat, saying that civil society focusing on crime prevention needs to be strengthened. And is there a way to get civil society organizations to be part of some of these steering committees in order to look at policies in relation to fighting crime and corruption? There's, I think, two more comments that have come in. There's a question there: how far has OUTA monitored the nominations and selection of the national, the NYDA? I think that's in relation to the National Youth Dialogue and National Executive Board members. I hope I've got that right, but I think OUTA may be able to speak more in relation to that. I'm not too sure if Wayne is back on the call, but if not, we can certainly try and get the member who posed that question in touch with OUTA so that they can answer it directly. I'm going to ask all of the panelists just to share a broad sense of feedback to those questions that have been posed. Let's start with Moiketsi, and then we can go to others from there.
Thank you so much, Zakira. I think I will. I want to take the one around, civil society and focusing on, crime prevention, but also just making sure that, we are part of the steering committees of all these important bodies, particularly as we fight to combat corruption together. I think for me, and I just like the point that has been made, particularly around even the electoral amendment, because one of the things that we have been emphasizing as well as the National Youth Coalition with the young people is, voting, or rather, as it relates to, voting didn't end on the 29th of May, right? And what that means is that we need to follow up after the vote. And part of, following up the vote for us has looked like, getting our young people to start, commenting on bills, for example, or proposed bills such as, the Public Disclosures Act around whistleblowers and all those things, right? So getting, in particular, working with Parliament as well, especially part of the civil society bit of it, where our young people are in those structures and they're represented, and they're getting their voices heard. But also, earlier on, Karam also talked about G20 and the C20. So I mean, this week, part of what we have been doing as the NYC is that we also want to lead the Y20 process, right? And we've, recently, finalized the engagements with DECO and relevant stakeholders within the G20, but also with NYDA as well, around, us shaping the Y20 engagement so that, again, young people are able to contribute in the G20 in a much more meaningful way as part of also, fighting against corruption. So yeah, that is just my bit, Zakira.
Thanks for that, Moiketsi. Let's get Lawson, your final comments and round up.
Thanks, Zakira. Just a couple of things, and picking up from some of the comments in the chat. So I think the issue around involvement in crime prevention. I think I refer back to the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which speaks to a whole of society approach. There's a role for civil society. The new Office of Public Integrity that has been proposed is going to have a very preventative focus. It will be able to proactively investigate systemic corruption in different sectors, and there'll be a role for civil society in the way that Corruption Watch has collaborated, for example, in terms of investing corruption within the health sector. There are other examples of that. Picking up on another point around the sort of the macro thing that Faisal spoke about. We've got the UN Convention Against Corruption. We've got the OECD guidelines. There's a level of international cooperation that does exist. As I mentioned earlier, we very much into the era of transnational organized crime, and collaboration between those sorts of agencies becomes critical. And then the final point is around, the comment that was made earlier in the chat about getting, credible patriots to participate in structures. And I think that speaks to the point that Ila Gandhi raised about that, the place to start is to strengthen community structures and to get those structures, the SGBs, the community police forums and the like, positions they're being occupied by people who really have the best interests of South Africa at heart, rather than people who are there for their own personal agenda. So, it's about active citizenry at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Lawson. Letlo Khonolo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Zakira. I guess maybe a few comments from me. On the question around the political context into next year and having the local government elections in 2026, I think, one of the critiques of the Zondo Commission was also that it did not focus around local government corruption. And I think we might be in for surprises, going into that. I think as civil society, we might want to really look into what's happening there and have greater focus on what's happening in local government, and especially because of the state of municipalities. Many of them are in coalitions, and many of them have issues of mismanagement. So I think we don't want surprises as civil society. I think we might want to look into the state of local government next year in prep for the local government elections in 2026. And then on the electoral reform, I mean, I've been part of that process quite closely, and I guess my sentiment is that there is lack of political will, to be honest, because I mean, this process has been going for quite some time. But I guess like let's be hopeful. Maybe this time around, the panel and submissions to it might be helpful, and then we can get some change in that regard. And I just wanted to also respond to what you said about the NPA and opening up the appointment process. I think it's a great idea, and willing to really put my head in helping with strategizing around doing work on that. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Letlofonolo. And as you were speaking, I was just thinking about the issue of party political funding as well, which in a pre-election year and in a build-up to political party campaigning will become a quite an issue that needs to be under the spotlight as well. I want to ask Karam to come in, and just before that, thanks Stefani from Outa. I see Becky Timber, there's a response there on the National Youth Development Agency. And I'm sure you'd be able to follow up directly with Outa there. So thanks for that, Stefani. Karam, go ahead.
Just very briefly, Zakira, because I see we at the end of the time. Ella Gandhi's comment triggered me a little bit around the fact that we do need to acknowledge that there is a climate of fear out there, that possibly in this given moment, we're not winning when it comes to building a speak out culture. That even from the standpoint of Corruption Watch, that's the idea that the call to action to the public is to report corruption is something that we need to be really cautious about, because we're asking people to come forth and be whistleblowers in a context where increasingly it's extremely dangerous for them to do so. So I do think that there needs to be a reckoning that we need to have as civil society around these issues, around the fact that we do need to continue to fight for law reform and institutional reform, but that law reform in and of itself is not going to shift things. That we do need a significant culture shift in the country in terms of being able to support that kind of speak out culture to really shift the sentiment within the general public around whistleblowers, around the important role that they play, and that how we need to rally around them broadly as a society. So, I think there are fundamentally there are cultural questions that we need to grapple with when it comes to kind of changing the current trajectory and addressing that climate of fear. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Karam. Very quickly, just there are a few points that emerged here. One, I think, is around the evolving nature of corruption in state capture. One, you have the Zondo Commission and all that played out in the past, and there's still much that needs to be done, both in terms of accountability for the businesses, individuals within the state, etc., that have been implicated. There's the systemic issues, but then there are new issues of corruption and the nexus between organized crime, corruption, as well as both private and public sector corruption. The issue of the new anti-corruption agency, how that begins to build a new anti-corruption architecture for the country into the new year, is something that we need to keep an eye out on. As Karam indicated, the day-to-day corruption, the cultural change that's needed. Interestingly, I've seen, one of the an activist, Faisal Mambu, is beginning to pioneer the idea of putting a sticker on your car saying, I refuse to give bribes. So if you stop by a police officer, that's the first thing that is seen on your car. So there's some interesting initiatives that we can look at into the new year. There's issues around, I think Wayne brought up the variety of strategies and tactics that's needed from a civil society perspective in order to really have a pinpointed approach towards different avenues of corruption that we're beginning to see. So both in terms of legal avenues, policy reforms, the activism that Moiketsi highlighted, and I think as part of the ongoing monitoring of civil society that was brought up by Letlofonolo as well. Then there's the systemic issues, electoral reform, procurement reform that I think Lawson, Kasek, and others are beginning to look at as well. And also the broader political issues that we constantly need to be making sense of into next year, especially given both the national political dynamics, local political dynamics that may be underway, but increasingly from a geopolitical perspective internationally, how we begin to weigh up what may be taking place in the country. This, just to conclude, Anti-Corruption Week will conclude on the 10th of December. A number of organizations are having different activations in different parts of the country. And if you, would like to be part of them, please do give us a shout so that we can see how best to circulate some of the information through to you. There is this big NACAC conference that's taking place on International Anti-Corruption Day, which is the 9th of December. And I think many organizations will be there. And hopefully that will give us, at least from government's perspective, a bit more of a clearer sense of where the country is headed to into the next year. From DoD's side, over the last few days, we've been visiting a number of sites of alleged corruption and state capture. And it's quite astounding to see the number of infrastructure projects that have been abandoned after millions of rands have been poured into these projects. And that's something that I think we want to highlight in the next year, whether it's all stadiums or courts or whatever it may be that have simply been left abandoned, and now the new contractors, etc., have to be found. So there's quite a bit that we need to look at, and I think the last word is to say, as Karam had indicated, we constantly need to be on guard. We may be making some headway in terms of tackling state capture and corruption, but it's not something that we can look away from for even a moment, because I think our country's history teaches us that we need to constantly connect the dots and keep an eye on issues. For that, I'm going to thank everybody for attending. Hopefully we can pick up this conversation into the next year, and we hope that everyone here would have a safe festive season as well. Thanks everybody for joining in.